From the book Tavistock Institute for Public Relations in the chapter Propaganda and Psychological Warfare, John Coleman writes about a military tactic called shock and awe, in which through its investigation opens up many interesting questions regarding its use and abuse in relation to power, dominance, control, and manufacturing public consent. Quote, "Shock and awe achieving rapid dominance." This is the National Defense University text, written in 1996, that became the theory behind US intervention in the Middle East and the war against Iraq in March and April of 2003. Quote, "Shock and awe," says the text, "is intended to be the, quote, non-nuclear equivalent of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Says the now out-of-print study guide of that terrible tragedy, says, quote, "The impact of those weapons was sufficient to transform both the mindset of the average Japanese citizen and the outlook of the leadership through this condition of shock and awe. The Japanese simply could not comprehend the destructive power carried by a single aeroplane. This incomprehension produced a state of awe," end quote. Besides using massive firepower for psychological purposes, the publication also includes extensive discussion of propaganda operations. Quote, "The principal mechanism for achieving this dominance is through imposing sufficient conditions of, quote, shock and awe on the adversary to convince or compel it to accept our strategic aims and military objectives," the writer states. "Clearly, deception, confusion, misinformation, and disinformation, perhaps in massive amounts, must be employed," end quote. Psychological warfare in combat. This is the full text of the infamous, quote, shock and awe doctrine, published in 1996 by the National Defense University in Washington. The concept is to gain complete control over the will of an adversary, as well as the perceptions and understanding of target peoples, literally making an enemy impotent to act or react. It is worth noting that all of these words and descriptions were found in textbooks used to condition students attending classes conducted by John Rawlings Rees at the British Army Psychological Warfare Bureau, where Rawlings was a master theoretician. The quote, shock and awe doctrine is described as a strategy to achieve the systematic destruction of military capability through attrition, where appropriate, and to use overwhelming force to paralyze, shock, unnerve, and ultimately accomplish the moral destruction of an opponent. The International Conference on Population and Development, called the ICPD, a program of action presented at the conference called for massive propaganda effort, utilizing the mass media, non-governmental organizations, commercial entertainment, and academic institution in an effort to, quote, persuade people in developing countries to change their fertility preferences. A revision to the original text, added to accommodate representatives from developing countries, urges that communications activities carried out by donors, quote, for advocacy purposes or to promote particular lifestyles, end quote, should be labelled in such a way that the public will be aware of their purpose, and that the, quote, identity of sponsors should be indicated in an appropriate manner, end quote. Despite this recommendation, which imposes no mandatory restrictions on aid donors, the, quote, communication section of the document remains a very dangerous and politically explosive part of the New World Order agenda. Now, what is even more interesting from that segment of the book about this military tactic is that you can also apply it to something like the conspiracy behind the 9/11 attacks as being an inside job, in the sense that it produced a shock and awe effect on its own population and on, of course, a global scale through its televisation, which definitely shocked a lot of people at the time, to possibly initiate and produce a state of collective psychic chaos in the mind, incomprehension, and fear in its own people, which would inevitably set up a psychological foundation for the people to be completely bewildered, to then only being able to, in the last resort, rely and trust on its own corrupt government for an answer to such chaos, or alternatively for the government themselves a financially lucrative scapegoat, especially when you look into the array of numerous primary interests that there were to initiate an Afghan war, or how it all radically expanded the power of the US government on its own civilians through something like the Patriot Act. So this militaristic tactic of psychological warfare can definitely be reapplied in different ways because it follows very much a similar principle to many other tactics that I've talked about, as it can be even seen as similar to the Rothschild energy principle in economics, which I've talked about before, which relies on the psychological response of shock and awe to harvest information from the public in relation to reshaping consumeristic demands and what that can tell you about the psychology of a particular population.